Hi everyone, I am Ana Melissa Perez, a PhD student in Applied Economic Department at the University of Minnesota. I am in charge of this section, so I'll introduce a little bit. So in this section we have two papers that we are gonna discuss today. One is related to the food prices in a dollarized economy in El Salvador, which is by Professor Luis Sandoval at the University of Texas Tech. And the second paper is related to what do we know about the food prices and its determinants in Latin America, which is led by me. So don't wait more and let's get started with these presentations. And thank you for being here.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. As Ana Maria said, my name is Luis Sandoval, and I am a professor at Texas Tech University. So let me share my screen, make sure that everybody can see what I see. Okay, if anyone can just give me a thumbs up to make sure that you're seeing the screen. Yes, all right. So the title of the presentation has changed a little bit. This is a working paper, so we're going with a more sort of attractive title for it. And the title is going to be The Cost of a Healthy Diet in El Salvador from 2012 to 2022. And there is a knowledge gap, and we're going to make the argument for that knowledge gap that we have. And as you're going to see, it has a lot to do with inflation, specifically for food prices. I would like to acknowledge my two authors, co-authors, which are going to be Jose Carlos Ordóñez and Adrián Hernández from Zamorano University in Honduras. So, as you may have know, you already know, of course, inflation is a very tricky topic. You can see in the graph, using 2015 as the base year, we have inflation for the general consumer basket, which is going to include pretty much everything. And you also have data for the food items basket in El Salvador, Guatemala, and also the United States. What I want you to notice is that, for example, in the case of El Salvador, you can take a look at let me get the pointer. At the very dark blue line, that's going to be the general inflation that El Salvador has been experiencing. And then in orange, you see is the food items inflation that El Salvador is experiencing over time. Then you have in dark green, the general inflation experienced by Guatemala. And in light blue, you're going to have specifically inflation for food items. And finally, for the case of the US, you see in purple, general inflation. And again, in a slightly lighter color, you have inflation of food items. So in the case of El Salvador and Guatemala, we see that food items are seeing a higher inflation rate than the general basket of goods. And that doesn't happen or has been consistently happening in the US. So there is a lot of things that we can try to understand about inflation, but I wanted to bring to your attention that in case of these two Central American countries, food is getting more expensive than most of the items that we have in the basket. And of course, when we take a look specifically at the inflation rate that all of these countries are going to be experiencing, in the case of El Salvador, having a dollarized economy is having a very similar behavior to the economy in the US. Guatemala, which has its own currency, which is the quetzal, is experiencing just overall higher food inflation than El Salvador is experiencing. So what is my argument for this? Is that if we are going to understand inflation and the prices of food items, specifically of the items we need for a healthy diet, we need a set of tools and not just one to help us actually better understand the behavior of the food of foods. So we know that access to food is going to be basically a universal human right. And we are going to achieve it when everybody has access to food. And that's not me saying it, that's FAO saying that it's a human right. Now, those of you working in food security know that food security is based on 4 pillars, which is going to be availability, access, utilization, and stability. When we talk availability, that's basically saying that the food exists for people to actually consume it. Access is either physical access to the food or economic access, meaning that if there is nothing prohibiting you to actually go get the food, that is physical access. And if you have the economic means to actually do it, that is going to be economic access. Utilization is basically that it makes good to you, that you're not going to get sick from consuming the food. And finally, stability, that's that you have the economic and social conditions that are going to allow you to correctly eat over time. Being an economist, the focus that we're going to take is access, specifically economic access to food. And the 2 factors that are going to be affecting the most or determining the access to food is going to be cost and income, either of individuals or of the households that we are going to be studying. And when it comes to metrics and indicators, there is a wide variety of indicators that we can use to actually measure food accessibility. For example, you can use the basic food basket, which to those of you that are familiar with it, you know that it's going to have slight variations depending on the country where you are, because each country is going to actually establish what are going to be the food items that are going to be included in the basic food basket. Although the methodology is very similar, there are slight differences within countries. Then we can also use, for example, the percentage of expenditures in foods, which has been used by IFPRI over the years, and that depends very heavily on the use of household expenditure surveys, which is a methodology developed by Smith and Subandoro back in 2007. You can also use the affordability of a healthy diet, which is a new indicator developed by the Food Prices for Nutrition Project, and now is included in the World Report for Nutrition and Hunger. So there is a lot of tools that we can use. What is the problem? The problem is that if we're going to be using only the basic food basket to actually understand how food prices are changing over time, it is going to be a limited instrument. Why? Because, for example, there is a fixed number of items and the quantities that are going to be included in the food basket. It is not going to allow for substitution. And also, the food items that are going to be included in the basic food basket are usually the subject of temporary price controls or regulations when those prices start to actually go up. So to my point of view, it's going to be a very limited instrument if you just want to use the basic food basket. Then we have the other extreme, which is going to be the cost and affordability of a healthy diet, which has not been designed for actually country-specific analysis. It is really good when you want to compare how the trend overall at the macro level is going and to make comparisons between countries. But it's not going to allow you to actually go and do a deeper analysis or even try to conduct a simulation that is going to help you better understand what is happening with food prices. Also, we have seen, if you have done some work in Latin America in the last years, we have seen that most of the funding that has to do with food prices and food policy research has been moving away from Latin America to Africa and Southeast Asia. So in the recent years, Latin America has been overlooked when it comes to food prices research. There is still research going on. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that most of the resources have moved to other regions of the world. And finally, we know that the literature that we have available exploring the cost of healthy diets in Latin America is going to be very limited. There is very few of us that are doing this research, and as a result, there is not much information available to go around. So we're going to try to overcome some of these limitations with this project or this research paper. So what are going to be the 2 benchmarks that we are going to do? And I'm not going to show you the calculations because that's something that we're not going to discuss in this session, but we can do it if you want to do it later. The 2 benchmarks are going to be the basic food basket, which, as I told you, fixed number of items, focuses only on energy and protein. It's very subject to transitionary price regulation, but it's used to understand the consumer price index. So the basic food basket is very, very popular. In some countries, it is also used to actually establish the minimum weight that the population is going to be receiving. So it's very popular and it's currently used for policy purposes. In the case of the cost and affordability of a healthy diet, it has been developed, as I told you, by the Food Prices for Nutrition Project, which is over at Tufts University. It is already included in the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World Report, so it's actually made, it's a very novel indicator, already included for the last 2-3 years in the report, so it's gaining a lot of importance too. And the problem that we have with that we see as a limitation with the cost and affordability of a healthy diet is that it actually uses, and it's not a problem, it's a limitation that it uses a woman typical height and weight who is not pregnant nor lactating as a reference individual. The basic food basket is going to be using a representative individual of the population, and the methodology that we use also uses a representative individual of the population. So we believe it's going to be more appropriate for policy analysis than just limiting what are going to be the factors going into the calculation. So what is the methodology that we follow to actually try to bridge the gaps that we have about nutrition and food prices right now? Is to first use price from the Consumer Protection Agency of El Salvador. That is the agency that when we were doing this research was collecting price data. So what we ended up was with weekly prices for about 48 food items from January 2012 to December 2022. Okay, so we have weekly price data for 48 food items. We could have collected more price data for more food items. However, what we are going to be doing is an optimization exercise. And we already know from past research that we have conducted that some of these food items are never going to show up in the diet that we are going to be estimating. For example, if you have a ribeye, it's too expensive, even though it may be a high quality protein, it's going to be just too expensive for the purposes that we have. So we focus on the 48 food items that we know for sure are going to appear at some point in the calculation that we're going to do. Working with weekly price data was too much information for the moment. So we actually averaged the weekly price data we had to come up with a monthly price for each of the food items that we have. So we just reduce the size of the data we have available. In the data set that we have, because we requested this data set, we did not collect the data ourselves. When we got the data, we have missing data from June 2019 to March 2020. We asked for this data that was missing. However, we did not get the response after that. So you're going to see there is a gap in the analysis that we have for those months. Then we mix the price data that we have with nutritional information from the INCAP, which is the Nutritional Institution of Central America and Panama. And from there, we get the nutritional information of the 48 food items that we have. So what we are going to be doing is a linear optimization problem where the optimization function is going to be the minimization of the cost of acquiring a total of 15 nutrients. And that's one of the most important differences that we are going to have with the basic food basket. The basic food basket in the case of El Salvador is designed to satisfy the needs of energy and protein. We go above that and we said, no, let's do the 15 most important nutrients that we have available in the INCAP food composition table. So we have, or we are trying to make sure that that basic food basket that we're going to be estimating is going to be as nutritious as possible as it can be. Then the representative individual that we're going to be having follows the same methodology as the basic food basket. We take the distribution of the population by age and gender, and then we create a representative individual of the population, which is just a weighted average of the all the individuals we have available. And then, according to the last survey conducted in El Salvador, there is 3.28 members per household. So the representative household that we have is going to be the nutritional requirement for one individual times 3.28. So that we have representative individual and a representative household. And we also, after that, we make the calculations for the cost of acquiring all the nutrients that a representative household and family needs. And then we estimate what is going to be the vulnerability of the population according to the cost of the diet that we are going to be getting. This is sort of what it looks like. What you have in the screen is on the horizontal axis, the month. You can see that it goes from January 2012 all the way to December 2022. What you have on the vertical axis are going to be grams of food. So when you add them up, it's going to be all the food that a representative household should be consuming to actually acquire all the nutrients that they need to live a happy life. Okay? What I like to point out about this graph is that every time that you see that a change of color is happening, that means that a food item is either exiting or entering the food basket. Let me get something else here. Okay. So every time that you see that a color is changing, as I told you, that means a food item either came in or exited the diet. What is interesting about this is that, for example, the food with the highest participation that we observed was actually red beans. Red beans are a staple in the Salvadorian diet. And they, at the end of the day, had a 28% participation over the whole period of study. So it's a very important food item for El Salvador, which usually receives a controlled price. Also, other important things that I would like to point out is that, for example, the highest food item, the food item with the highest biological value can be eggs. However, eggs do not show up every single month. There is specifically moments where we see that eggs are going to exit the diet that we have, and instead we're going to have powdered milk, ground beef, even mortadella, if you're familiar with mortadella, and hot dogs to actually be the source of high value protein. So the optimization exercise is doing what we expect it was going to do, which was actually allow for substitution of the food items so that we can have the lowest possible cost for acquiring all of the 15 nutrients that a representative household was going to have. Okay? So it's just fascinating to see how it changes over time. And I can send you the working paper if you want to see a little more detail. When it comes to the actual price of the diet, there are things that I want to bring to your attention. What we have now is also, again, in the horizontal axis, all the months of study, and then in the vertical axis is going to be the nominal cost of the diet. What you see in the green line is actually the cost of the urban food basket. What you see in the orange line is going to be the rural food basket. And in purple, we have the cost of the nutritionally balanced minimum cost diet that we were estimating. Things to think to actually notice about this graph is that, of course, the rural food basket is always going to be cheaper than the urban food basket. And then we see that for the case of the minimum cost, nutritionally balanced minimum cost diet that we estimate, we see that actually it behaves going up and down from the urban cost of the cost of the urban food basket. Okay, we have a very three instances where we see a peak in the cost of the diet. One happened around June, July of 2014, which is when the country of El Salvador experienced an increase in prices of the red beans. Then we have the COVID period, and then we see the inflation that we have been experiencing in the recent years. So it is not moving exactly at the same rate that the basic food basket is going to be behaving. In some instances, for example, when the basic food basket remains very stable, we see that the minimum cost diet is going to be experiencing a downward trend. And then when we have the peaks are going to be more pronounced than what we can see in the basic food basket. And also, it's going to be growing at a steeper pace after January 2021, sort of suggesting that actually prices are going, or the cost of the diet is increasing at an accelerating rate that actually we can see from the basic food basket. In the next graph, what I have done is that we actually created an index so that we can see with a little more detail what is happening with the cost of the basic food basket and the cost of the nutritionally balanced minimum cost diet. So starting all of the three baskets in January of 2012, we see that in the first period, when we have the urban food basket actually remaining very constant, the minimum cost diet is showing a downward trend. In the second period that we notice, even though that all of the baskets are experiencing an upward trend, we see that the minimum cost diet has actually a very, very specific peak, showing the shock that the price of the beans induce in the cost of the diet. Then in the third period, we see that even though there is a slight decrease in the cost of the basic food basket, the minimum cost diet actually has a steeper decrease. In the fourth section that we see in there, we have the COVID period increase that we saw in the prices. And finally, in the fifth one, we see that the cost of food is actually going up way faster than the basic food basket actually is showing. So what is the takeaway from this? First of all, that the basic food basket is a good indicator. Yes, but it's very limited because it's not going to show the cost of acquiring of the nutrients. And also, it's not going to be very responsive to the price shocks that the country may be experiencing. Okay? So that is going to be sort of the main takeaway. It's not as flexible as we would want it to be. Now, for an additional comparison, you have in the screen the period from yearly data from 2019 to actually 2024. In the bars, you have how many people is estimated to be undernourished, specifically in Central America. That is data specifically for Central America. And you see that in 2019, it was estimated that 50 million people were undernourished in no, sorry. This is the proportion of the population that could not afford a healthy diet. So in 2019, 50 million people in Central America were estimated to not be able to actually afford a healthy diet. In 2024, 47.5 million people were estimated to actually not being able to afford a healthy diet. If you want to take a look at it as a percentage of the population, that is going to be the trend line, where it goes from 28.7% in 2019 to 25.9% in 2024. So almost 1 in 4 households in Central America is not able to afford a healthy diet. And that is according to the cost of a healthy diet indicator that is included in the State of Food Security and Nutrition Report up to 2025. So this is the latest report and data we have available. What is the argument that we make? That we don't have data that is going to be very specific for doing an in-country analysis. So we propose an alternative approach. What we say is, we can use the estimation that we have of the minimum cost diet and actually deriving more information than just a single value. So using the methodology proposed by Smith and Subandoro, what we say is that, a household is going to be very vulnerable to actually food insecurity and not to be able to afford a nutritious or healthy diet if they are going to be spending more than 75% of their income in food. That is very high vulnerability. That means that a household is going to be making less, that is in December of 2022. A household making less than $350 a month is going to be very, very vulnerable to food insecurity when it comes to access. That is about or around $3.56 per individual. And we estimate using data from the World Bank, because they actually have the income distribution tables, that 41.8% of the population in El Salvador is going to be very vulnerable to food insecurity, specifically in food access. Then we have a high vulnerability, which is going to be households that are going to be spending between 60 and 75% of their income to actually have a diet that is going to take into consideration all the required nutrients. That is going to be households making between $350 and $404 per month. We estimate that 5.9% of the population in El Salvador is going to be in that range. Medium vulnerability are going to be those spending between 50 and 65% of their income in food, specifically making sure that they acquire all the nutrients they need, and they are going to be making up to $525. That is going to be about 21 to 22% of the population. And finally, the ones with low vulnerability are going to be spending less than 50% and making more than $525, and that is going to be about 30% of the population. The indicator of affordability of a healthy diet makes the cutoff point at 52% of the expenditures. So for us, that will be equivalent to medium, high, and very high vulnerability. So in comparison, according to the state of nutrition in the world, about 25%, 26% of the population in Central America cannot afford a healthy diet. By our estimate, making it a little more demanding, we estimate that that is going to be 69.3% of the population. So we are actually coming up with a higher estimate than we actually have in the world report. Okay, so what are going to be the conclusions so that we don't take more time? First of all, is that the minimum cost diet, which is going to be nutritionally balanced, that we estimate, is first of all more comprehensive than the basic food basket. Why? Because we use more nutrients and allow for substitution. So it's going to be actually more data coming in. The problem is that it is not going to be representative of cultural preferences or even representative personal preferences of consumers. But it's not a dietary recommendation that we are making. We're making an economic indicator. So we're just making sure that what is the cost of acquiring all the nutrients. However, as you saw on the graphs, it's going to be more sensitive to price shocks than the basic food basket, which tend to remain very stable over time and also to decrease at a slower rate than the minimum cost diet that we estimated. Also, the inclusion of the levels of food insecurity is more informative than the cost and affordability of a healthy diet, which only is going to give you one value. We propose actually having 4 values to actually have more information available to policymakers. And finally, we don't think that we should be replacing any of the existing indicators. We believe that in order to have a full picture and something that is going to be very holistic to actually understand what is going on with prices, you actually should be using the 3 indicators because all of them are going to have limitations. And when you use them together, you can actually derive a more understandable picture of what is going on with food prices in this case, which we have a case study for El Salvador, but which you can replicate very easily to any other country in Latin America, or as a matter of fact, you can do it in any country in the world, as long as you have price data. And that would be it. I don't know if you want to do questions now or you want to leave them to the end.
There are no questions so far, so maybe we can continue and then ask all the questions to all the presenters.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation. So are you seeing very clear my slides? So thank you so much for all being here. I am Ana Melissa Perez. I'm gonna be presenting this paper called "What Do We Know About Food Inflation and Its Determinant in Latin America." This is a paper with a co-author called Julian Fernandez, a professor in the Universidad Javeriana, and I am Ana Melissa, a PhD student in the Applied Economic Department at Minnesota. So first, I'm gonna be introducing sort of the main issues that have been affected prices and food prices in Latin American region. First of all, we have in 2008 the recession. So this recession caused it would cause a demand shock, which made consumers unable to buy goods. In addition to that, we have cut an investment because foreign countries didn't come to Latin America to make investment, which caused depression on currencies in our countries, and that make imported goods more expensive for most of the countries. This of course affect prices because imported goods affect all consumers. In addition to that, we had several shocks due to oil prices, which caused inflation by both ways or affected prices by both ways. First, because we produce oil, some of the countries produce oil, so it can come as an income effect, but as well as if prices are high, it affects the demand of the consumers. So we had both effects on prices. In addition to the 2008 recession, we have in 2016 some supply shocks, especially that affected Brazil and Colombia, and due to the El Nino severe drought that caused in those regions. In addition, we had changes in oil prices. Continually, we have the COVID pandemic that affected the supply and the demand, and also transportation costs and fiscal transfers that occur at the same time. And recently, we have the Russian-Ukraine war. So that's sort of what has been happening. As you can see in this price, we had a headline inflation, which has all the inflation that is occurring in those countries. So as you may see in early 2008, we have Dominican Republic with inflation higher than 10%, but other countries they were below 10% in inflation. This stabilized a little bit, but then it became what I call you like the Nino effect that changed food prices in Brazil and in Colombia. Subsequently, we have now the pandemic. Um, so the first countries to react was Brazil, but then after that it happened in Colombia and in Chile. We have a high effect like reaction in prices, which were about 10 to 13, 14%. But when we analyze food prices, which is where we are interested, we see that these levels change more. So you see that in the first recessions, we had countries with around 20% of inflation, in food inflation, but in our current pandemic or after the pandemic in 2022, we had that Colombia and Chile had reached more than 20% prices, food price inflation, which is worrisome given that these countries may have people who are vulnerable, and having that high prices is affecting, of course, the poor population. You see other countries such as Mexico and Peru, they do have also as well values that goes between 10 and 15 percent of food inflation as well in Brazil. So why do we focus on Latin America and for this food inflation analysis? What, according to the Inter-American Development Bank, it says that Latin America share of agri-food export is about 80%. So let's say about 1/5 of the agri-food that is exported comes from Latin America. So we are like important. In addition to that, we have vulnerable economies with production shocks that affect our prices because we have small and open economies. We are producers of agri-food, but we are also importers, so it affects in both ways. And so, as I said, we have countries who are vulnerable in case of the supply chain disruptions, and we also have limited processing to deal with these changes. In addition to that, this is a problem because we have populations who had informality jobs, who are poor, and having food inflation that goes about 20% in some of the countries affect to more vulnerable populations, given that they spend more of the income in food. So what is the goal of this paper? This paper has two goals. The first goal is to identify the supply and demand determinants that are influenced food price variation in Latin America. And the second goal is to understand the heterogeneous effect on how they changes country by country, given that when we do when most of the literature that do aggregate analysis, they don't focus on specific countries or and treat the region as a homogeneous region, which is not the case. So we are contributing to two strands of literature. The first strand of the literature is related to the determinants of food inflation, and we do it by using a novel method, which is called log-augmented local projection. It's a method that has less biased estimate than normal local projections or autoregressive vectors. So in addition to that, we are adding to the literature in food inflation in Latin America, which is not that big, as we all know. As far as we know, this paper is the first one documenting the determinants of the recent food inflations in Latin America and provides insights for policy makers to deal with future shocks. So by knowing what are the determinants now, they can know how some countries will react in a given shock of demand or supply. So we are having different data sources. The first data source comes from the food inflation from the World Bank, which compiles information from several countries. In addition to that, because they don't have food prices for Peru, we are using information from a Peruvian central bank. The second source comes from for unemployment gap. We are using data from the International Monetary Fund. For all the covariates, we are using different measures that like prices of the commodity prices factors, war cycles, geopolitical risks, and global supply chain pressure that comes from the Federal Reserve Bank. So we are using 6 different shocks. One is called the economic activity, which is a demand shock. We are using as well oil shocks from the supply, from the demand, from both sides, which is supply and demand, which is the inventories oil, because the inventories can they can know if there is gonna be a supply or a demand increase. So they according to that they make changes. So it goes in both directions. And we as well have monetary policies as a measure of demand shock. And the first method is based on interest rate on the U.S. Monetary policy, and the second method is also including interest rate from the U.S. policy, but as well using text analysis from central banks. So our sample have 7 countries, which we try to analyze the largest economies that we have in Latin America. We excluded Argentina and Venezuela for Venezuela because we don't have much information, and we excluded Argentina because they do have an atypical inflation that I'm gonna show later. And from South America, we included Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador. And from the other region, we include Mexico and Dominican Republic. We lack of much information for all the covariates and analysis that we wanted to do, so we were not able to include more of the sample of the other countries. So as I mentioned before, the inflation in Argentina is atypical compared to what we have in other countries, in Latin American countries. As you can see, before the pandemic, in 2019, the inflation was above 50%. So the food inflation. So we do believe that this is atypical, and recently in 2024 they do have values of 300%. So this is way too much for in comparison what we see in the other countries. So this is an outlier. So what is the method that we are using to analyze the shocks that we have on and how inflation determinants we are using a local projection, which basically a method that allows to make predictions and then compare the predicted values that we get with the value that we have when we have a shock. And then after that, we do the impulse and response function to understand how inflation varies when we have a given shock. This model has some advantage because it reduces the bias of the estimates compared to, as I said before, to vector autoregressive models, which because have more bias, but as well they do have more assumptions that we had to make. So that's our methodology. Our specification is the different in the left hand side we have the difference in inflation, and on the right hand side we have the intercept and the shocks that I already mentioned. This is shock related to the economic activity, oil shocks, and monetary policy shocks. We have the set of covariates, and then we have fixed effects. When we do pool analysis and gather all the countries, we do fixed effects, but when we do individual country regressions, we don't use fixed effects, and we have this error term. So the results that we have so far shows that when we do panel analysis of the 7 countries we are analyzing, we find no effect. But as you can see, this is such a good results because it provides insights that when we aggregate information, we are not able to identify sort of the results. However, when we do analysis by country and not like in the aggregate, we find heterogeneous effect. So you can see like economic activity, consumption, oil consumption, oil inventory, oil supply, and all the monetary policies do not have effect, but the coefficient of the intervals are so big that because of the variation that we have in each country. However, when we do the analysis without aggregating and we analyze any of those shocks, we see different situations. So the world economic activity basically is an index that shows the industrial production on the world. And we see that when we analyze those shocks, we see how the inflation in food price, the food price inflation in Chile increases as well as in Colombia and in Dominican Republic. So shocks of the production shocks do have effects on food inflation in Chile, Colombia, and Dominican Republic. When we focus on the monetary policy in the United States and how it affects food prices in Latin American countries, we see as well effects that were not seen in the pool analysis. So you can see, for instance, here changes, decreases in Dominican Republic. We see decreases in food prices in Peru. We also see a few decreases in food prices in Ecuador. So we see that when we have changes in monetary policy in the United States or increases in interest rate, we see decreases in food prices in South America and in Dominican Republic. And when we analyze the second measure of the monetary policy, which is introducing some text analysis by the central banks, we see a similar pattern. We see like a small effects on some countries, as Peru, Dominican Republic, a little bit in Ecuador, and Chile. Regarding oil consumption, we see as well that when there are shocks in oil consumption in the world, we see as well decreases in food prices in Brazil and in Mexico. We do see changes as well, and we see also few changes in other countries. The oil inventory, we don't see much of an effect on most of the countries. We see almost no effect from this, perhaps because it has like supply and demand shocks at the same time. So it's very difficult to identify food prices changes. On the supply side, or the oil supply side shocks, we as well see changes, for instance, in Dominican Republic, and we do see a little bit changes in Mexico as well. So the key takeaway that we have from this paper is that the panel analysis that we do in aggregate methods, pulling all the countries together, which is the normal analysis that people do when they analyze shocks and price shocks, or shocks and how they affect food prices or how they affect inflation. It doesn't show like a clear effect because of the heterogeneity that we have in the region. So, but however, when we analyze country by country, we see that economic activity shows raised food inflation in Chile, Colombia, and Dominican Republic. Monetary policy in the United States decreased food inflation in Dominican Republic, Peru, and Ecuador. and also oil consumption shock and oil supply shock as well affect food prices. The oil consumption raise food prices in Chile, Mexico, and Ecuador, and the oil supply shocks decreases in the Dominican Republic. So some of the conclusions that we have is that to be short on this is we studied the food inflation determinants in Latin America, focus on 7 largest economies: Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Central America, and Dominican Republic, using monthly information during 2007-2023. Our funding suggests that pulling all the country's highest effects on each country, which is a common approach that is done in macroeconomic analysis. On the future, we will focus on understanding the impact of food inflation on cross-rotation and food diversity and food insecurity. As you may see, or you saw in the previous slide, we have in some of the periods inflation that goes about 20% in food inflation, and that might affect how farmers can choose what to produce and how and what to sell in the market. So this is one of the conclusions that we have, and that's all that I have for today. Thank you so much. If you have questions.
Yeah, I have one. This is Graciela. Uh, so, how did you account in this study when talking about the monetary policy for the fact that from all those countries that you analyzed, Ecuador is the only one who uses dollars? So, changes in monetary policy from the U.S. will affect other countries. However, we tend to not to have a low level of inflation because of that, because of the dollar. That's the first question. And the second question is, when we are talking about the oil supply and oil, we are talking about petroleum. How did you account for those countries that are oil producers? And like again, going to Ecuador, we are oil producers, and we are really affected by the price of oil. So whenever it goes down, it really affects a lot more than any change in monetary policy. So those are my two questions.
So, for the first question is related to changes in monetary policy in the United States. So we agree that we have different currency. However, changes because we do export goods and import goods. So changes in the interest rate do affect us, all the countries, indirectly or directly due to exchange rate. And so it sort of has a path to affect food prices. And in the second questions, we that you say that how we address, we try to analyze separately for each country, so we can see what the effects are higher in each country. What I try to say is, like, for instance, if you say oil prices will affect more Ecuador than other countries, that's what I'm showing in those graphs separately. Because when we pull all the countries together, we sort of don't see anything. But when we pull each country, we can see that the changes affect the shocks. Oil prices affect more some countries and not all at the same time. I don't know if that's clear. Also, the shocks are like an index that measure those changes, and so they do measure in general the change of the supply and demand of oil.
Okay, thank you.
I also had a question for Luis. So regarding your presentation, I saw that you had changes of exiting some goods, and changes in pasta, for instance, and red beans, sort of modifications. Could you please elaborate a little bit why this is happening, or why are they having changes in the food diet, especially some of the staple goods? Staple
Sure.
goods.
So the methodology that we have is a linear optimization problem. That's why I don't show the equations, because most of us in economics know that's a relatively simple methodology. So basically, when we are doing the optimization problem, the constraints that we are going to have are going to be on the nutritional requirements. So what we do is, for example, we said a representative individual and then a representative household is going to need, I don't have the specific values, but X amount of calories, and then this amount of protein, and that for all of the 15 nutrients that we have. So we optimize so that we want to minimize the cost of acquiring all the nutrients subject to the nutritional requirements, sorry, to the nutritional composition and requirements that we're going to have for the 48 food items. So what the problem is doing is basically trying to find the combination of goods that is going to make sure that the household and the representative individual get all the nutrients that we are imposing the restrictions for. So for example, when you have suddenly an increase in the price of eggs, suddenly the protein of eggs is not affordable, or is not going to help you achieve the lowest possible cost. So what the exercise does is basically takes away eggs, and then it's going to bring other food item for which that protein is going to be the lowest possible value to achieve the optimization problem that you have. That's why we see, for example, red beans going out at certain points, and also eggs. An interesting example, because we have done this exercise for other countries, specifically for Honduras, in there, what we see is that when the price of eggs increase, the high value protein that is going to be entered in the diet is going to be tilapia. So when we say to people, if you want to achieve the nutritional requirements, don't need eggs, eat tilapia, because that is going to be the lowest cost that you can do it. It doesn't make sense to people because they don't want to have tilapia for breakfast. However, it is just a substitution for nutrients that the problem does.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.